There are three macroeconomic goals: economic growth, full employment, and stable prices. In this video, we will talk about full employment, how we calculate the unemployment rate, the types of unemployment, and also why we criticize the method we use to calculate the official unemployment rate. What is unemployment? How do we calculate the unemployment rate? The unemployment rate is defined as the percentage of people in the civilian labor force who are without jobs and are actively seeking jobs. There are three things we need to consider here. The first thing we look at is the civilian labor force. The second thing that is important here is that the person needs to be without jobs, but also actively seeking jobs. To understand the civilian labor force and the unemployment rate, let's take a look at this chart. First of all, we do not take the entire population because population under 16 years of age are not supposed to work. They're either students or kids, babies. We do not expect them to work, so we take only population age 16 and over. Within that population, we have two groups: those who are in the civilian labor force and who are not in labor force. In the civilian labor force, we have those who are employed and unemployed. Who are employed? Let's first take a look at the employed in the civilian labor force. Anybody who has a full-time job and who has a part-time job is considered employed. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does not distinguish full-time and part-time workers. Even if you work just 1 hour a week, you are still considered employed. If you're self-employed, you are employed. Even if you don't make any money from your own business, or even if you make losses, you are still considered employed. The second group in the civilian labor force is the unemployed. Who are those unemployed people? Those people who don't have jobs, and remember, they're also actively seeking jobs. Those people could be the new entrants to the labor force, like the new graduates from college. Those people could be re-entrants. For example, some people sometimes leave the labor market. They stop looking for a job, and then after a while, they start looking and they become re-entrants. They become unemployed. And those people who are laid off, who lost their jobs or who quit their jobs, those are also considered unemployed as long as they're actively looking for a job. Now, who are not in labor force? Who are not in the civilian labor force? First of all, the armed forces. The armed forces are not civilians. They're working for the government. They have jobs. However, they're not civilians, so we do not count them in the civilian labor force. Household workers. Stay-home moms and dads, the homemakers. Those people, although what they do has value, they're not working in the labor market. So we do not count those people unless they're actively looking for a job. Students, retirees. We do not expect those people to work, so we consider them to be not in labor force. Persons with disabilities. institutionalized persons, such as those people who are in mental health institutions and also who are in prisons. Those are not in labor force. Finally, discouraged workers. This is actually pretty important because remember, for the unemployed under the civilian labor force, the requirement is that the unemployed has to be actively looking for a job. If someone becomes discouraged because of the labor market conditions, and if that person stops looking for a job, that person leaves the civilian labor force and enters in not in labor force. So we call these people discouraged workers. The condition to be unemployed, again, is to be jobless and also to be actively looking for a job. The minute we stop looking for a job, we become discouraged, we leave the civilian labor force. Once again, how long do we have to be looking for a job? Well, the unemployment rate is a monthly data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics gathers this data every month and publishes this data on the BLS website, and therefore they're asking in their surveys to the people in that survey group if they've been looking for a job in the past 4 weeks only. So, for example, if we are in the month of September and if we are jobless, so if we are actively looking for a job in the month of September, we are considered unemployed. But if we stop looking for a job in August, that means we are now not in labor force. We're not in civilian labor force if we're not looking. So, how do we calculate the unemployment rate? The unemployment rate, remember, is the number of unemployed in the civilian labor force. Let's say it again. It is the number of unemployed in the civilian labor force. It is actually the percentage of unemployed in the civilian labor force. Let's make this a math statement. What is the unemployment rate? We can tell that from this chart. It is the number of unemployed in the civilian labor force times 100 because it's a percentage. Let's now do an example. We have this data about unemployment. We have the population under 16 and institutionalized. Remember, we do not count these people. Besides that, we do not count these people. Besides that, we have the people not in labor force. Again, we do not count these people. And we have those people who are in the labor force. Who are those people in the labor force? Those are the employed and unemployed. What is the unemployment rate? It is the number of unemployed. It is the percentage of people in the it is the percentage of unemployed in the labor force. And we can just plug in the numbers if we have those numbers, and we'll do that. Here we have 14.2 million people unemployed out of 154.1 million people. When we plug in these numbers, we can see that the unemployment rate is 9.3%. Now let's try this example. Let's compute the civilian labor force, the unemployment rate, adult population, and the labor force participation rate. That means we need to add a couple of definitions here. First of all, let's focus on the civilian labor force. The civilian labor force includes only employed and unemployed. Employed plus unemployed. And the unemployment rate is the percentage of unemployed in the civilian labor force. We have all these data from this table, so we can calculate both the civilian labor force and the unemployment rate. Let's start with these two first. First of all, we just got the data from the table. The civilian labor force, once again, is employed plus unemployed. And the total number of people in the civilian labor force is 154.9 million people. What is the unemployment rate? It is the number of unemployed divided by the civilian labor force. We plug in these numbers. We have the number of unemployed and the number of people in the civilian labor force times 100. So the unemployment rate is 6.7%. This is the actual data from 2013. We also want to calculate the labor force participation rate and adult population in this question. To understand these two concepts, I want to take you back to our basic chart. Okay, once again, we want to come up with the numbers for adult population. What is adult population? Remember, we do not count anybody who is under 16 years of age. So what we have here is adult population. Adult population. And what is the labor force participation rate? Well, when we look at this chart, only these people are participating in the labor market. Only those people who are employed or unemployed but looking for a job, they're participating in the labor market out of all the people in adult population. So what is the labor force participation rate? So I can put that here. Labor force participation rate is basically the number of people in the civilian labor force divided by the number of people in adult population times 100. So we can calculate that using the numbers that we have in the question. Here we have adult population is the sum of the civilian labor force and not in labor force. Since the civilian labor force is both employed and unemployed, we can calculate this number. So basically, we need to add up all these numbers here. Okay, so I have 246.7 million in adult population. Now I can calculate the labor force participation rate. What is the labor force participation rate? Once again, it is the number of people. I will just put that here. Labor force participation rate. It is the number of people in the civilian labor force divided by adult population times 100. When we plug in these numbers, those people who are in the civilian labor force, we have 154.9 million, and as adult population we have 246.7 million people. And when we plug in all these numbers and do the calculations, we get 62.8% for the labor force participation rate. How do we get the unemployment data? The Bureau of Labor Statistics is responsible to publish the unemployment data every month. That means we need to go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. Okay, we're on the BLS website. Where do we get the unemployment data and employment data? We go to economic releases and then go to employment, unemployment monthly data and click on employment situation, summary table A. That will take us to the summary information about all the economic situation for the month. And we also see the comparison for the most recent months. As we see here, we have the August 2020 unemployment rate here, as well as the civilian non-institutional population. And also we have the number of people in the civilian labor force, the labor force participation rate. Among those in the labor force, we have the number of people employed, and we have the number of people unemployed. And we also have the number of people not in labor force. We see a lot more information on this table, a lot of statistics about the unemployment rates for the age groups, unemployment rate by different race groups, the unemployment rate for different education groups, and also duration of unemployment. That is also important. Are people unemployed for a short period of time or for a long period of time, for example, 17 weeks and over? And we can compare the most recent numbers with the previous months. We have July and June of the same year here, and we can also compare this unemployment number with the same month last year. So we'll do this analysis. We do this analysis in our discussion forum. I will just leave it to you, but I want to mention two other things here. As you see on this table, we have the part-time workers for economic reasons. Remember, part-time workers are considered as full-time. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does not distinguish between part-time and full-time workers. Even if you work an hour or 2 hours, a few hours a week, you are considered full-time. But a lot of these people are actually willing to work full-time. They're working part-time for economic reasons because they cannot find jobs. Another one important item here on this table is discouraged workers. Remember, discouraged workers are those who were unemployed, who were actively seeking a job, but they become discouraged. They stop looking for a job and they leave the civilian labor force. Now they're not in labor force. To understand the limitations of the unemployment rate, Let's take a look at these situations. In each of the following, what happens to the unemployment rate? Sue lost her job and begins looking for a new one. Since Sue currently doesn't have a job and she is actively looking for a job, she is unemployed, and therefore the unemployment rate increases. John, a steel worker who has been out of work since his mill closed last year, becomes discouraged and gives up looking for work. In this case, John is discouraged. He leaves the civilian labor force, so he's not counted as unemployed. In this case, the unemployment rate will be lower. In the last case, Sam, the sole earner in his family of 5, just lost his $80,000 job as a research scientist. Immediately, he takes a part-time job at McDonald's until he can find another job in his field. In this case, Sam is working part-time, although he is underemployed. Again, we do not distinguish those people who are underemployed who work part-time for economic reasons. As far as the Bureau of Labor Statistics concerned, Sam is employed. So the unemployment rate will not change because he had a research scientist job yesterday. Today he has another job at McDonald's, so the unemployment rate will remain the same. When we look at John's situation and Sam's situation in these examples, we can tell that the unemployment rate has limitations. It's not a perfect measure of the unemployed. So, what are the criticism of unemployment? First of all, involuntary part-time workers counted as if full-time, just like Sam in our example. Secondly, discouraged workers are not counted as unemployed. If we add these people as unemployed, then the unemployment rate will be much higher. In fact, if we go to the BLS website, we see that the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually calculates the unemployment rate using different criteria. The official unemployment rate is called U3 unemployment. That is U3, total unemployed as a percent of the civilian labor force. This is the official unemployment rate. But again, if we count all these people who are attached to the labor force, and also those people who are employed part-time for economic reasons, then the unemployment rate will be much higher. For example, the current official unemployment rate is 8.4%. If we count all these people who are working part-time for economic reasons and who are discouraged workers, who are marginally attached to the labor force, the unemployment rate, U6, would be 14.2%. We can also compare them using this chart. We compare the official U3 unemployment with U6 unemployment. That the official rate is the gray line, and the U6 rate is the more comprehensive unemployment rate. U6 is the blue line. During the Great Recession, the official rate was as high as 10%. But when we look at the U6 rate, the unofficial rate, it was 17.10%. And during the 2020 COVID recession, the official rate is at the highest point so far. The official rate was 13.3%, but if we count all these people working part-time for economic reasons and also those people who are marginally attached to the labor force, discouraged workers, the unemployment rate would be 21.2%. What are the types of unemployment? First of all, we have frictional unemployment. Those are the individuals searching for jobs or waiting to take jobs soon. These are the new graduates, or these are the people in between jobs. So this is not a concern because this is a short-term unemployment. We will always have frictional unemployment because people will always change jobs, or students will graduate and they will also look for a job. The second type of unemployment is structural unemployment. Structural unemployment occurs due to changes in the structure of the demand for labor. This happens all the time, again, because the structure of the economy changes all the time. Going back to the 1990s, when we had new technologies, people had to adapt to those new technologies to keep their jobs. Those who couldn't keep up with the new technologies, their skills, their old skills did not match the new jobs skills, and they lost their jobs. Another example would be, let's say, the coal miners. So those coal miners' skills are not suitable for any other jobs in other industries. If they lose their jobs because of the change in demand for coal, then they will need to maybe go back to school. They need to be retrained. They need to gain new skills to be placed in other jobs. Otherwise, they will lose their jobs and they will be structurally unemployed. This is a longer term unemployment. It is a concern because it requires retraining, it requires gaining new skills, and it is a longer term unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is caused by the recession phase of the business cycle. Remember, we have the downturn in the economy during recessions. We have the long run economic growth. We have the real GDP here in time. And when the economy enters a recession during this business cycle, from a peak to a trough, we have a recession. And during a recession, because the production level is going down, because real GDP is declining, firms will lay off workers, and therefore there will be more people unemployed during the downturn period of the business cycle. We call this type of business cycle, we call this type of unemployment cyclical unemployment, and it is a great concern because this is happening because of a recession. When that happens, our goal is to take the economy back to the longer run economic growth rate. We want to be on this expansionary period so that firms start employing workers again. We want to eliminate cyclical unemployment. In summary, although we cannot eliminate frictional and structural unemployment, because these type of unemployment will always happen, we want to eliminate the cyclical unemployment. We want the cyclical unemployment to be zero. What is full employment? Full employment is when there's no cyclical unemployment. Once again, at full employment, the unemployment rate will be the total of frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. Cyclical unemployment will be 0. And therefore, we can say that full employment is when we are on the long run path, because on the long run path, we do not have any recession, we do not have any economic decline, so we have reached the long run potential level of output, and the economy is not experiencing cyclical unemployment. And our goal is to be on this potential level of economic growth. Our goal is to eliminate the cyclical unemployment. And that is our major macroeconomic goal, as we stated at the very beginning of this lecture.